If you're over 60 and you eat bread, even something as simple as a slice in the morning, there's a strong chance you're making a mistake that almost no one ever explains clearly. This has nothing to do with carbs being bad or giving up bread forever, but everything to do with the type of bread you're eating and the quiet effects it can have on your blood sugar, your weight, and even your muscle strength over time. Maybe you've noticed that you feel more tired after meals than you used to, or that hunger shows up sooner than expected, or that keeping your weight stable feels harder now even though your eating habits haven't changed much. It's worth asking whether the bread you've relied on for decades could be playing a role in all of that without you realizing it. In the next few minutes, you're going to understand why bread affects the body differently after 60, what common mistake many people make simply out of habit, and how a simple change in bread choice can help support steadier blood sugar, protect muscle, and improve long-term health without forcing you to give up foods you enjoy. This one adjustment alone can completely change how you relate to bread going forward. For most of life, bread feels familiar and safe, something that never needed much thought because it was always considered a normal part of a balanced diet. For years, that approach worked well enough. But after 60, the body begins to operate under different rules, and food choices that once felt neutral can start producing very different effects. Digestion slows, metabolism becomes less flexible, and suddenly the difference between white toast and whole grain bread over 60 is no longer theoretical, it becomes something you can feel. At this stage, carbohydrates are processed differently. Blood sugar tends to rise more quickly and remain elevated longer, muscle becomes harder to preserve, and weight gain can happen even when eating patterns stay the same. That's why bread and blood sugar after 60 deserves more attention than it usually gets. What once seemed like a harmless daily habit can quietly influence energy levels, appetite, and long-term metabolic health, often without obvious warning signs. A truly healthy diet isn't fixed in time. What supported your body at 30 or 40 doesn't automatically support it at 60. Priorities shift toward strength, balance, independence, and stability, which changes the role of healthy carbohydrates after 60. Bread becomes especially important because it's eaten so frequently, and the difference between refined bread and the best bread for seniors can shape how you feel day after day without drawing much attention to itself. Many people assume the main issue is how much bread they eat, but the bigger factor is usually what kind of bread is on the plate. The glycemic index bread seniors consume varies widely, and some loaves push blood sugar up quickly while others release energy more gradually and predictably. As insulin sensitivity naturally declines with age, that distinction becomes increasingly important and ties directly into bread and insulin resistance aging. When you realize that bread choice can influence blood sugar, weight, and even bread and muscle loss over 60, everyday meals start to look very different. There's a subtle but meaningful mistake that often goes unnoticed because it feels familiar and comfortable, and understanding it requires taking a closer look at the type of bread that's been quietly showing up on the table all these years. The big mistake. The real issue isn't eating bread itself, but relying on the wrong kind of bread as a daily default. In most cases, that means soft, refined white bread that looks harmless, tastes familiar, and feels easy on digestion. It's affordable, convenient, and has probably been part of your routine for years, which is exactly why it rarely raises suspicion. Most commercial white breads are made from heavily processed flour where the bran and germ have been removed, leaving behind mostly starch. That process strips away fiber, vitamins, and minerals, creating a food that breaks down very quickly in the body. This is where many white bread health risks seniors experience begin, especially when it comes to unstable energy and rapid changes in blood sugar. When refined white bread is eaten after 60, glucose enters the bloodstream quickly, triggering a strong insulin response followed by a drop that can leave you feeling tired, hungry, or unfocused not long after eating. Repeating that pattern regularly places extra stress on insulin regulation, which is already more vulnerable with age. This is how bread and blood sugar after 60 issues tend to build slowly, without dramatic symptoms, but with real long-term consequences. It's important to be clear that white bread isn't poison, and eating it occasionally won't undo everything else you're doing right. The problem is frequency and habit. As a regular choice, refined bread offers very little benefit compared to better alternatives. It doesn't promote fullness, it doesn't support stable energy, and it doesn't contribute meaningfully to muscle or metabolic health. Choosing the best bread for seniors means looking past softness and convenience and paying attention to how that bread behaves once it's inside your body. Two slices of bread can look identical on the plate while producing completely different responses internally depending on fiber content and structure. That response, not the calorie count, is what matters most when concerns like bread and insulin resistance, aging, and long-term vitality are involved. And understanding what happens during digestion is the key to seeing why some breads work against you, while others quietly support your health. To really understand why bread matters more after 60, it helps to look at what happens inside the body once bread is eaten. Bread doesn't stay as bread for long. It's broken down into glucose, and the speed of that process determines how the body responds. That speed is measured by the glycemic index, and the type of bread chosen plays a quiet but powerful role in daily energy, appetite, and long-term health. Refined white bread is digested very quickly, so glucose enters the bloodstream at a rapid pace and insulin is released to bring levels back down. On its own, that process is normal, but when it happens repeatedly over months and years, it can gradually push the body toward bread and insulin resistance, aging, where cells become less responsive to insulin and blood sugar becomes harder to control. This is why bread and blood sugar after 60 deserves closer attention. As insulin sensitivity naturally declines with age, refined bread demands a stronger response from a system that's already under more strain. The result is often a short burst of energy followed by fatigue, cravings, and that familiar feeling of being hungry again soon after eating. This isn't about willpower, it's simply how the body reacts. Whole grain and lower glycemic breads behave very differently. Because they contain intact grains and fiber, digestion happens more slowly and glucose enters the bloodstream at a steadier pace. That leads to more consistent energy, better appetite control, and fewer highs and lows throughout the day, which is one reason whole grain bread over 60 is consistently linked to better metabolic outcomes. This difference shows up clearly in everyday life. A breakfast of white toast with jam often leads to hunger and low energy a couple of hours later, while dense whole grain or sourdough bread for older adults paired with eggs or yogurt tends to keep energy stable and appetite under control. The calories may be similar, but the internal response is completely different, which is exactly why choosing healthy carbohydrates after 60 makes such a noticeable difference. Research supports this pattern, showing that diets higher in whole grains are associated with better glycemic control and a lower risk of type 2 diabetes. Fiber slows glucose absorption, reduces stress on insulin, and helps control inflammation, appetite, and energy balance. And once blood sugar is better regulated, it naturally opens the door to another important piece of the puzzle that often goes unnoticed: muscle health. Muscle health after 60, yes, bread choice matters. Bread and muscle don't usually get mentioned in the same conversation, yet after 60, they're more connected than most people realize. Muscle isn't just about strength, it's about balance, independence, metabolism, and maintaining an active life. Once muscle is lost, rebuilding it becomes far more difficult, which makes preservation especially important. With age, muscle mass naturally declines in a process called sarcopenia, often so gradually that it's barely noticed at first. Nutrition plays a major role in how fast this happens, and research shows that diets higher in refined carbohydrates, especially white bread, are associated with a greater risk of muscle loss compared to patterns that emphasize whole grain bread over 60. The connection comes down to metabolic stress and inflammation. Frequent blood sugar spikes increase inflammatory signals in the body, and chronic low-grade inflammation makes it harder to maintain healthy muscle tissue. When refined bread also lacks meaningful micronutrients, it becomes clear why white bread health risk seniors extend beyond weight and glucose control and can quietly affect muscle quality over time. Whole grains support the body in a very different way. They provide B vitamins for energy metabolism, magnesium for muscle function, zinc for tissue repair, and fiber that supports digestion and reduces inflammation. This combination helps explain why people who regularly choose the best bread for seniors often maintain better muscle strength and functional ability as they age. The difference shows up in daily habits. Starting the day with refined toast and coffee provides quick energy but little support for muscle, while choosing sprouted grain bread benefits paired with eggs or cottage cheese delivers steadier fuel, fewer insulin spikes, and nutrients that help preserve strength. Over time, these small choices compound quietly and consistently. Protecting muscle isn't only about exercise or protein intake, it's also about reducing unnecessary metabolic stress so the body can use nutrients efficiently. Bread choice influences blood sugar, inflammation, and insulin response, all of which shape how well muscle is maintained. And once that connection is clear, another practical concern naturally comes into focus: how bread choice affects body weight. Weight regulation and bread types. Weight after 60 often feels frustrating because habits may not have changed, yet the scale does. In many cases, the issue isn't how much is being eaten but the quality of what's eaten, and bread plays a bigger role here than most people expect. Long-term studies consistently show that higher intake of refined white bread is associated with gradual weight gain over time, while whole grain bread over 60 tends to be neutral or even supportive of weight stability. The difference isn't dramatic in the short term, but it adds up steadily. Fiber explains much of this effect. Whole grains slow digestion, promote fullness, and help regulate appetite hormones. A sandwich made with dense whole grain or sourdough bread for older adults keeps hunger in check far longer than the same sandwich on refined bread, reducing the urge to snack later in the day. Blood sugar stability matters just as much. Bread and blood sugar after 60 are closely linked, and unstable blood sugar often drives cravings for quick, starchy foods. Refined bread creates sharp rises followed by crashes, while lower glycemic options smooth that cycle and help appetite regulate naturally, making healthy carbohydrates after 60 easier to manage without strict rules. The difference can feel subtle at first. Swapping white toast for sprouted grain bread benefits or seeded whole grain bread often leads to fewer cravings and more consistent energy, especially between meals. Over time, those small changes translate into better weight stability without feeling restricted. Sustainable weight control after 60 isn't about cutting foods out. It's about choosing foods that align with how the body now responds. Selecting the best bread for seniors is less about sacrifice and more about working with metabolism instead of against it, which naturally brings the conversation to the most practical step of all, deciding which breads actually belong on the plate. So what should you be eating? Once everything starts to make sense, the solution becomes surprisingly practical. There's no need for extremes, fear, or cutting bread out completely. The real goal is simply to make better choices more often. When navigating healthy carbohydrates after 60, upgrading the type of bread you eat can quietly shift daily meals from working against your body to supporting it. Whole grain bread over 60 should be the starting point. True whole grain breads contain the entire grain kernel, which means more fiber, more vitamins and minerals, and a slower, steadier release of energy. This slower digestion helps control blood sugar and keeps you full longer, which is especially helpful as metabolism changes with age. Dense whole wheat or rye breads where whole grain appears clearly as the first ingredient are solid everyday options, while labels that begin with enriched flour usually signal a product that's been stripped of most of its benefits. Sprouted grain bread benefits become especially noticeable when digestion isn't as smooth as it used to be. Sprouting partially breaks down starches and increases nutrient availability, making these breads easier to digest and gentler on blood sugar. Paired with eggs, avocado, or nut butter, sprouted grain bread provides steady energy without sharp spikes, which is why it's often considered one of the best bread for seniors. Sourdough bread for older adults also deserves attention. The fermentation process changes how carbohydrates are digested, leading to a lower glycemic response and less stress on insulin. When made with whole grains, sourdough combines flavor with metabolic benefits, making it easier to stick with healthier choices long-term rather than feeling restricted. Breads made with seeds and high-fiber ingredients like flax, oats, barley, or rye offer additional advantages. These fibers support heart health, improve glucose regulation, and increase satiety. A slice topped with cottage cheese, smoked salmon, or hummus turns bread into part of a balanced, nourishing meal rather than empty filler. Learning to read labels carefully becomes one of the most valuable habits you can build. Look for whole grains first, aim for several grams of fiber per slice, and choose breads with short, recognizable ingredient lists. Once you know which breads support blood sugar, muscle, and weight, the focus naturally shifts to how to eat them in a way that maximizes their benefits every day. Information only becomes useful when it shows up in daily life, and improving bread choices after 60 doesn't require complicated rules or major changes. Small adjustments, applied consistently, tend to produce the biggest results, especially when it comes to bread and blood sugar after 60. Pairing bread with protein and healthy fat is one of the most effective strategies. Even high-quality bread digests faster on its own, but adding eggs, Greek yogurt, cheese, nut butter, or avocado slows digestion and stabilizes blood sugar. Sprouted grain bread with eggs at breakfast or sourdough bread for older adults with tuna or hummus at lunch creates a completely different metabolic response than bread eaten alone. Portion awareness matters, not as restriction but as intention. 2 slices may fit well into a meal, while eating several without noticing can gradually work against weight and blood sugar goals. Deciding ahead of time how bread fits into the meal helps reduce the long-term effects associated with white bread health risks seniors often face when eating on autopilot. Bread also works best as part of a balanced plate rather than the main event. Pairing it with vegetables, lean protein, and healthy fats improves overall nutrition and supports a better glycemic index bread seniors benefit from. A slice of whole grain bread alongside a large salad and grilled chicken will feel very different in the body than a bread-heavy meal with little else. Variety plays a quiet but important role as well. Bread doesn't need to appear at every meal, and rotating in other healthy carbohydrates after 60 like oats, lentils, quinoa, or brown rice keeps digestion and appetite more stable. Many people notice fewer cravings and steadier energy simply by alternating bread days. Paying attention to how you feel after meals may be the most underrated tool of all. Fatigue, bloating, hunger, or brain fog aren't personal failures, they're feedback. Adjusting bread type or portion often brings noticeable improvements within days, and once those signals are understood, long-held beliefs about bread naturally begin to shift. Common misconceptions. As understanding deepens, old assumptions tend to surface, especially around a food as debated as bread. Confusion often leads to fear or overly rigid rules, but clarity makes better decisions easier and more sustainable. Bread itself does not cause diabetes. The issue comes from frequent consumption of refined high-glycemic breads over time, particularly when physical activity is low. This pattern contributes to bread and insulin resistance aging, while whole grain bread over 60, eaten in reasonable portions and balanced meals, often supports steadier blood sugar instead of disrupting it. The idea that all bread is empty calories overlooks the nutritional value of well-made whole grain, sprouted, and seeded breads. These provide fiber, B vitamins, minerals, and plant compounds that support digestion, muscle metabolism, and energy regulation. Avoiding bread entirely often means missing out on some of the most practical healthy carbohydrates after 60. Eliminating bread completely is rarely necessary and often unsustainable. Choosing better options like sourdough bread for older adults or sprouted grain bread benefits tends to produce better long-term results than strict avoidance. Quality matters far more than absolute restriction. Research consistently shows that whole grain and lower glycemic breads can fit into a health-supportive lifestyle, while frequent refined bread consumption can quietly undermine it. Once that distinction becomes clear, fear fades and confidence takes its place, making everyday food choices calmer, smarter, and easier to maintain. Conclusion. Now comes the most important part, deciding how to use what you've just learned. Knowledge alone doesn't change outcomes, but small intentional actions do. If bread has been part of your routine for years, today can be the point where that routine becomes more deliberate. The type of bread you choose can influence blood sugar, energy, weight, and long-term strength, and you don't need perfection to benefit from that awareness. One better choice at a time is enough. Take a moment to think about what bread is in your kitchen right now, how you usually feel an hour or two after eating it, and what might change if your bread choices started working with your body instead of against it. If this video brought clarity or helped something finally click, support the channel by liking the video, sharing it with someone who could benefit, subscribing, and turning on notifications so you can continue learning about health, longevity, and living well after 60. And before you go, take a look at the next video on your screen. It builds on what you learned here and dives deeper into simple habits that can make everyday life stronger, easier, and more enjoyable.